Your orals?
It's much easier.
We're here to interview Professor Kristen Luker, who's a sociologist at the University of Berkeley. She has two major books out, Taking Chances, Abortion and the Decision Not to Contracept, and Abortion and the Politics of Motherhood. She's planning a third book involving the history and politics of implementing sex education programs. I'm going to start by asking her a very general question that is more a sort of a personal history. How did you come to sociology? If you can tell us something about how you got to your area of interest.
Okay. I guess it started out something I don't tell a lot of people, but I was a military brat. My parents were in the military, and so I moved once a year, twice a year. In the long visits, we once lived somewhere 4 years, I remember. So I was always coming into new communities and always sort of psyching out what was going on. So when I came here to Berkeley as an undergraduate, like all well-socialized young women, I was a psychology major. And the first courses in psychology I took were so boring that I couldn't believe that this was a genuine discipline that people would study. So I had a hole in my schedule, and I took an 8 a.m. sociology class with a woman named Shirley Starr, and it was wonderful. What I'd been doing for my whole life, there was actually a discipline of trying to understand people's lives and how they lived and what social organization was about. And that's how I became a sociology major. And then I got interested, still while I was an undergraduate, in decision-making theory, because that seemed a very interesting and elegant way of thinking about how people thought about their social world. And then as a graduate student, I got very interested in feminism, and all of that sort of naturally ended up in my interest in abortion and sexual and reproductive behavior.
Would you tell us a little more about, say, your more personal experiences, say, that led you to the issue of abortion in particular?
You know, it's interesting. I guess having had friends who had abortions when I was at Berkeley must have had something to do with it. I don't think of that as consciously being part of it, but I think what was, I know the emotion was when people began to debate abortion in the late 1960s. Here I'd studied decision-making theory, and the idea that women could have no control over their environment, that your entire fate could rest on the head of one tiny little sperm, was so horrifying to me that it was something I wanted to understand. You know, I wanted to understand why things were changing, where the pressures came from. With my first book, I wanted to understand why there were so many abortions in a society with so much contraception. So for me, I got, by the way, very interested in demography, and did a lot of my graduate work in demography, because it seemed to me that was sort of where the issues of gender and power and stratification were happening, you know, underneath all those statistics of birth rates and death rates and migration and contraception were sort of novels going on that had real people's lives. So for me, it was a very concrete way to think about gender that was very accessible and very interesting. And I'll tell you, just as a footnote, when I was in graduate school, I remember my professors couldn't believe anybody would want to study gender. I mean, it wasn't even called gender. There wasn't a field called gender. What was interesting about gender? And what was interesting about contraception and abortion? You know, that wasn't part of formal sociology. But luckily for me, Yale sort of practiced benign neglect, so I was able to do my work on that.
Tell us more about, like, say, your work experience. I think at some point you said you worked in a clinic.
I did. That's where the genesis of the first book, which was actually my dissertation, came from. I was a volunteer in Planned Parenthood, actually right down here in Hayward. And in the course of a summer, I saw a number of women coming in who thought they were pregnant. They were coming in ostensibly to get a pregnancy test or to get actually contraception, but they came in because they thought they were pregnant. And what was so interesting about all of them is that they'd already had an abortion in the intervening 6 months. And that so sort of shook my notion of what I thought I knew about the world. You know, I sort of thought if you had an abortion, you did those things so you wouldn't be at risk of an abortion again within a very short period of time. And that was, I think, what prompted me to think about, I guess I'd always really thought of abortion as a backup to contraception. So I couldn't quite figure out why there were these people who were having abortions. And already by then, this was 1970, close to 3 out of every 10 pregnancies in the state of California was ending in an induced abortion. And again, that didn't make sense to me, that there should be so many people looking for abortions, given that there was so much contraception in the society. So when I read the literature, the explanations, the theoretical explanations, just made me angry. You know, they either said women didn't have contraception, and I knew as a fact that many of them did from having worked in this clinic, or they said women were psychologically conflicted, and that's why they didn't use contraception. So it sort of set my feminist teeth on edge. So the combination of an interesting problem and no literature that could really explain it very well got me interested in trying to untangle a puzzle. And I should also tell you, I started out doing a piece of survey research. You know, I was going to survey women who had babies versus women who had abortions. And it was only as I kept trying to do that I realized it was incredibly boring, that we knew so little about abortion that I was sort of trying to do it I was trying to explain something when the whole problem needed explaining. So that's how I moved to give up this sort of very straight survey research piece of research to ask the bigger question about how come there was so much abortion in a society like California's where there was so much contraception.
It's very striking when you describe your feeling about women being sort of at the mercy of a single sperm, because it's in fact quite similar to the way you describe the pro-choice women in your book. And one of the things that struck me reading the book, and has struck many other people, is that it's a very political subject, and that you really are very clear about taking a stance of ethical neutrality. And I wonder if you want to talk about your decision to do that.
Well, it's interesting because that's the single decision, I think, that's been most controversial about the book. And one of the ironies, there are many ironies, just one that comes to mind, it's only people on the left who think that it's a neutral book. Because if you're a pro-lifer, all you have to do is read those first few pages where I say, look, I'm not going to debate whether or not abortion is right or wrong. I'm only going to examine how some people come to be pro-life people and some people come to be pro-choice people. To them, that's the equivalent of saying, look, I'm not going to debate the Holocaust. I'm just going to figure out how some people came to be Nazis and other people didn't. So built into it is already a very profound political choice, which they recognize. And they may not recognize it explicitly, but tacitly, most of them, the review of my book in the National Right to Life News basically said, gee, how could this person talk to all these wonderful right to life women and not be convinced, you know, and not come out with a ringing denunciation of abortion? So that is the first thing, you know, that in a way to be ethically neutral, or to take the stand of ethical neutrality on a controversial issue, is in a way not to take seriously the claims of the other side that it really is murder. Another one of the ironies is that I had a pretty self-conscious political goal, which was that I was so aware, having interviewed people, that people would pick up a book and read the first 5 pages to see what side you were on, and then throw it down if you weren't on their side. And I wanted to fly in under the radar of people who thought they knew everything there was to know about this issue. I wanted people, in a sense, on both sides to get a sense of how the other side thought about it, sort of what the world views were. And in a way, you never know if you're successful with a book that way if you're the author of it. But I think if I had taken a more polemical stance, fewer people would have read it. I would have been preaching to the converted. And I wanted to talk both to the middle ground, people who weren't activists on either side of the issue, and maybe if I we're lucky to talk to, as I say, fly in under the radar of the people who are already convinced.
One thing, a lot of what you're talking about has to do with who the book was talking to. And I guess another question, a sort of earlier question, is, in a sociological sense, would there have been a way of doing the research that was the research itself, outside the context of the competing communities reading it, that was somehow neutral? Do you feel like was that a sociological goal for you, or was it sort of irrelevant?
I'm not sure what you're asking me.
That you're talking about how people understood your book once it got out there. And my question is, do you feel like the work itself, outside the context of the actors reading it, gives a fair and balanced portrait, or is that impossible?
Oh no, I think so. I mean, that was my goal. And it's always an ideal that you can never live up to. You're always a product of your own social milieu. You know, there's no external observer. That I'm as much a member of my race and my class and my gender, and I'm particularly a moment of I'm the product of a particular historical moment. So my goal was to put as much of that aside as I could, and to be able to untangle the puzzle as best I could. The puzzle in this book for me was, where was the juice coming from? Where was the emotion coming from? Not only why do some people end up being pro-choice and others pro-life, but why is it that when they talk to each other, when they talk to me, it's incredibly emotionally powerful. People, I think I say this in the book, would cry during interviews with me. So I wanted to find out what it was about it that was so emotionally powerful for people. And it's, for me, a goal, and by the way, I think I do understand that, at least an answer that I was satisfied with, which was that it's such a powerful issue because abortion calls into question people's deepest values, which they're not used to articulating, much less arguing about. And so it makes people crazy to talk to somebody whose discourse calls into question the things they most deeply believe, but they don't have a language for sorting that out. You know, they can't really say to each other, oh, we're getting angry because our values about sexuality and about gender and about child rearing all are at odds with one another, because these values are so deep, you sort of assume that every right-thinking person shares them with you. So in that sense, I got an answer that I thought worked for me, you know, that scratched my intellectual itch. Whether it's true in the capital T sense, I think other people will have to do more work on. And I'm very clear that the ideal of being as neutral as you can is only that. You know, a perfect example is I interviewed a woman who had 12 kids, and I couldn't help but thinking, how are we going to send these kids to college? And her answer was, she wasn't. You know, what was the point of going to college? They were only going to go to college if they were good. And if they were good, then they could go to community college and live at home, and then they could go to San Diego State, and they could work while they went to college, and that college was a scarce resource that you only gave to very talented people. Well, as a bona fide member of the PMC, the professional middle class, my values were just blown away, you know, that I come from a social milieu where everybody goes to college, and you go away from home so that you can get the emotional distance to go on and pursue a career. I'm sort of mocking myself here, but it's true. And you don't work so you can get the best possible grades so you can go into graduate or professional school. So that just like the right to lifers, you know, some of my deepest values were sort of called into question by her assumption that, of course, you don't send kids to college unless they're very talented. You know, so it's, and in that sense, I learned a lot about myself and a lot about my values, and that's part of the gift of being a social scientist, I think.
The book has been criticized a lot exactly because of some of the things you're talking about, that you came very much from your social location, and that stance then of ethical neutrality was sort of a cover. Do you
Mhm.
feel like there's some way that you could have done better, or do you think that was, given who you are, that was sort of the best you could have done?
I think given who I am, it is the best
Mhm.
I could have done. I think if I had it to do all over again,
Yeah.
I would rewrite chapter 9 slightly differently. That's the chapter about the larger social context,
Mhm.
and I think it's called The Future of the Debate.
Mhm.
And you know what happened by the time I was at that point in the book, I was sort of exhausted. And talking about the debate in its national context, which is a very different debate than the debate I looked at. I really looked at the grassroots debate. And I said that in the book, but I apparently didn't say it clearly enough. And there's so little, by the way, empirical work on these sort of new social movements that I think people sort of look to my book to be the definitive book on the Right to Life movement. So if I had it to do all over again, I think I would have said more clearly than I did now that the national debate, that one of the interesting questions anytime you have a social movement where previously uninvolved people get involved in politics is how those movements get absorbed into existing political structures, which are mostly male.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, Rosalind Perchesky's criticized me for not talking about Henry Hyde and Jesse Helms, and that for me to say she argues that it's a debate among women is really wrong, that she sees it from her perspective as a debate between men and women. I think she's objectively wrong. I think that this debate would not be played out the way it is being played out if it were all men versus all women, or even some men versus some women. That what gives it its peculiar power is that it's an intra-gender debate, which is then absorbed into existing political structures, which are mostly male, and used often for that existing political structures' other ends. And I wish I'd said that more clearly in the last chapter, because sometimes, that by virtue of focusing on the grassroots part of the movement and the intra-gender part of the conflict, it's as if I think people feel that I let that other layer of structure off the hook. And I didn't, in the sense that it isn't as though I examined it and said it's not relevant. I just sort of didn't get to it as clearly as I should have. So if I had it to do all over again, I think I would have done it a little differently.
I guess my last question was sort of moving it to a slightly more abstract level, which was sort of the question of, you were saying that you should always try to be as neutral as possible. And there are also people who would say that if you leave your values out, that in fact it's sort of a way of taking a stand, somewhat as in terms of the way you were talking about the Right to Life people, and their response to your book. And that felt very clear to me when I was reading your proposal for your newer research in terms of the way that deals with AIDS, where potentially not taking a value stand could mean, well, I mean, people are talking about putting all gay men on Alcatraz, for example. So how do you feel like it's always worthwhile to try and take a value neutral?
Well, it's interesting. I think it's important to clarify a couple of things. One is your stand as a researcher versus your authorial voice, if I can use that. You know, that if you read my first book, it's no secret that I'm a pretty strong feminist. And so it isn't as though I've hidden that. That, as I said, I think I took that stand, ironically, to achieve something with the book that was consonant with my values. So I'm not arguing that you should be ethically neutral as a person or as a scholar. And in fact, I suspect that the only reason that I could take that stand in Abortion and the Politics of Motherhood is because in my heart of hearts I'm a Puritan. You know, I'm a person with a extremely vigorous superego. And I actually spent a lot of time obsessing about that book. A colleague of mine at San Diego is an ex-Maryknoll priest, and I used to go in for ethics consults with him fairly frequently. One of the dilemmas about the abortion debate for a feminist is that if the feminist position is successful, which I think it is, that injures some women. You know, I talk about it in terms of the metaphor of Tilly's Vendée, that in any period of social change, there are people who are more, who have more to lose, that they're more vested in the old system, so that any kind of social change leaves them behind. And I think the Right to Life women are absolutely realistic in their fears that the feminist vision is inimical to their interests, at least in the short run. So the kinds of things I worried about in the book to myself were how do I justify being a feminist and holding values that are going to injure the people that I'm interviewing? And they're still women, you know, they're women whose values are very different from mine, but it seems to me you have to think about women more broadly than just the women whose values you share. So I don't think it's possible to be ethically neutral as a researcher, by the way, and I don't think it's desirable. You know, there's that French quip that tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner. To understand everything is to forgive everything. And one of the debates I had, actually, I remember having a discussion with Gloria Steinem where she couldn't understand why you would want to study the Right to Lifers. What was the point? They were benighted, they were wrong, what's the point? And it seems to me obvious that if you want to make this sort of basis pragmatic argument, you're better off understanding your enemy. You know, you're better off having a sense of where they're coming from and who they are, not just wishful thinking, but some real data. But on the more abstract level, I think it gets back to what I was just talking about, which is that if you're a feminist, you have to worry about the fate of all women, including those who are being left behind by the feminist revolution.
Interesting. Lisa was going to ask you some questions about...
Very related. You've talked about it a little bit in connection with ethical neutrality, but I wanted to ask more in general. You have your role as a sociologist in university, and then obviously you have outside roles. And do you find a separation between those, or have you found some unity in those?
Both. And I think it's interesting because I'm, for whatever reasons, intellectually and psychologically, I can't be both a partisan and a scholar. I couldn't be on the front lines of this debate and study it as well as I do. That I need some psychological and intellectual distance to have a sense of what the big picture is, you know, what the sort of moving parts of the puzzle are. But it's interesting because in the rest of my life, now that the book is over, I have been able to use my expertise in ways that I think are consistent with my values and what I think is important. So I have talked about the book a lot with lots of different groups of people, including, as I think I mentioned to you, a convent, which was one of my more interesting experiences. I will be doing some work here locally about California just passed a parental consent law that says that adolescents have to have their parental consent, have their parents' consent to have an abortion or see a judge. But your average 15-year-old doesn't know a lot about the judicial system, so that's got some more problems, so I'll be working on that. So I think I am an activist by being a scholar, that my contribution is to use my intellectual and analytic skills to give the best possible picture I can of what's going on, even, as I was saying, if it's something that we'd really rather not know, you know, even if there are facts about that are unpleasant, so that my goal is to be as accurate as I can be. Now, I don't deny that every step of that process, in both doing the research and doing the writing, is a judgment. And at that point, I mean, that's the sort of Zen paradox of it all. You know, that's when all of you, your personality, your background, your history, all play a role in how you think about those things. And you can never be free of those. You know, the quip that fish don't know they swim in water. You know, that you're just so aware of only the slightest part of the degree to which you're socialized and the degree to which you're a product of your culture. I just, one little example, very minor, is in the interviews, the Right to Lifers gave me very idealized versions of their family life. And they hinted to me that all was not as they would have me believe. So, for instance, a number of them quoted joked that their husbands were going to start a right-to-wife organization. And because I was a single person, I didn't know to push on that spot. You know, I heard this sort of idealized version of marriage, and I did sort of notice that they were telling me that there was tension between their role as an activist in the service of very traditional family roles and their family roles. But I didn't have enough experience in my own life to know that that was a point I should have pushed. And I do now, you know, all these years later I do now, but I didn't know that. So, you know, we learn.
Hey, another question about the connection between sociologists and moral.
Uh-huh.
I mean, you said on that second book on abortion and the politics of motherhood that you clearly had written it for people outside. You wanted both sides to look at the book and see what was going on. And I was wondering if that is your goal in general, to write for an audience outside the university, and if you think your work in general should affect the world outside the university.
I do, and I feel very strongly about that, and passionately, that I hate academics who only talk to each other. And I think it's actually, here's the Puritan in me coming out, sinful to enclose yourself in an ivory tower when there are important political and social and moral debates. But here's another Zen paradox. For me, it's always a tension between getting involved and getting too involved. That if I'm too involved, I'm not effective as a scholar. You know, I become really an activist whose goal is to achieve a particular political resolution, as opposed to a scholar whose goal is to understand all the forces at play and the configurations and how it all works. So my deepest admiration is for people, scholars, who can bring smart people into the debate, who can say, here's the problem, here's what other people before me have thought about it, I brought you up to speed, here's what I think about it. And it's really sad, I think, that we tend to look down on quote-unquote popularizers. You know, that I suppose you can veer too far in that direction too. But I hate academic books where you open it up and it sort of starts out, as I was saying, you know, it's in the middle of a debate with the unknown other. And I feel very strongly that it's important to talk to larger audiences. And I've been very lucky that way, by the way, that both of my books have been published by University Press Books, University of California Press, in fact, and yet they have been read by intelligent people who aren't necessarily members of academia. So and the Abortion and the Politics of Motherhood book got incredibly weird reviews as sort of interesting, different people read it and resonated to it.
So once your work gets outside of the university, like you had mentioned that you had testified for Congress and that Kennedy had asked for your work, is there anywhere that you draw a line? Would you allow your work to be used by anybody? I mean, given your feminist commitment, what if the Right to Lifers used it? Or say someone who wanted to put AIDS victims on Alcatraz?
Well, let me say this first. I think the correlation between the book you write and the book people read is 0.30 on the good days. Okay? That, in fact, it's very bizarre to read the reviews, and it's sort of like Rashomon. You know, they describe somebody that you thought you knew, but, you know, you're not sure. And I always think of that Marshall McLuhan story about Peace Corps volunteers that show villagers a film about village hygiene, and they ask the villagers what it's about, and they say chickens. And it turns out there's a chicken in one frame of the entire 30-minute film. And sometimes I feel like that's what happens to my books, you know, that people see one little part that they resonate with, and then it's chickens from there on out. So that's the first thing. Secondly, sometimes I think of the flow of human events as a river, where the most you can be is a little pebble that changes the flow a little bit, a few inches here or there. And the effect a book can have is has less to do with the book, I believe, than the larger social context. That there can be a book at the right time, in the right moment, that has an enormous effect because, in a sense, there's an audience for it. But by the same token, there can be a very good book that just doesn't have the audience then or ever. So I'm not terribly confident about the ability of any scholar or any thinker to change the flow of political and social events. But I would be, I have resisted people who try to use my findings in what I think are problematic ways. So, for example, some right-wingers have used the Abortion and the Politics of Motherhood book to argue that it's just class politics, that being pro-choice is just what those selfish professional middle-class women want, and it's just therefore a class-based value, nothing else. And in a way, that's the dilemma on both sides of the sociology of knowledge. If you locate people's beliefs in a particular social milieu, you run the risk of reducing them to that milieu. And I tried very hard in the book to say, look, these aren't merely the manifestations of people's worlds. There's a much more complex dynamic going on. But people didn't listen to that part. Just one footnote is I talk about in my sample how the pro-life women are not as well educated as the pro-choice women. And I was struck by someone, the clipping service that UC Press subscribes to, clipped a letter from a right-to-life lady in Oregon who wrote a letter saying, research has shown that pro-choice women are more educated and richer and they work more in the paid labor force, and she quoted all my statistics from my sample. And this just proves that they're selfish people, using abortions for their own selfish ends. And so, I mean, you're right, that's the kind of thing that I worry about. And that if, God forbid, somebody tried to use abortion and the politics of motherhood to, quarantine gays, would be my obligation to speak out and say they got me wrong. I think that is our obligation, by the way, is to not go along with the herd, to keep saying, I don't think so.
I wanted to talk a little bit more self-consciously about some things that you've touched on in terms of methodology.
Okay.
You talked a little bit about how you would rewrite the chapter on the context, and I want to ask you about the water that you, as the fish, are, take another one of your metaphors, are swimming in. What are the advantages of taking, when you're going to have to inevitably select where you're looking, who you're listening to, etc. What are the advantages of taking an approach of analyzing the discourse as opposed to other places that you could focus? Your work really focuses on the debates. And I want to first talk about the advantages and then get your sense of what the limits are.
Well, I tried to do both, in the sense that I tried to do, I thought I used four sort of bodies of data. I used the verbatim interviews. I used background information about them, which led me in that later chapter, I think it's chapter 5, to talk about how people were located socio-demographically in different social worlds. I used aggregate data, so I could talk about what was happening in the larger social world that these people were living in. And then finally, I analyzed a lot of their persuasive literature, a lot of the books and pamphlets and stuff like that. So what other data did you have in mind?
I'm not talking so much about the data and the techniques, but about what goes into what you presuppose when you look at a moral debate and say that's where the meaningful information is. That's what we need to understand. As opposed to say, I actually am very close to that right now, but I want to figure out what the options are, as opposed to saying what's important here is the greater political context or the material conditions or, so if you can just
Are you asking
clarify.
me, are you saying that in a way I should have synthesized this debate, that there should have been an authorial voice at the end who said, well, these folks believe this, those folks believe that, and here's what's right?
No, I'm not so much suggesting that that's what you should have done. What I'm trying to get clear is what presuppositions go into looking at debates, and how your work would differ if you looked somewhere else, and why you chose, and why you continue to choose to look there.
Yes, okay.
Is that a different question?
Let me answer it and see if I've answered the question you asked, okay? I have always used interviews because I think if you turn the tape on and ask people questions long enough, they'll tell you how they see the social world. Now, there's a whole body of cognitive sociology that isn't sure it quite believes that, that they are sort of philosophy of science problems about, if I ask you about your attitudes, are you really telling me, is this any different than the survey research problem, where if I ask you your attitude on abortion, am I getting anything other than just a response to my stimulus? Am I really tapping some pre-existing cognitive structure there? And my sense is you are. And I go in and talk to these people for 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, and I think I don't get reality. What I get is their picture of reality. That I get what it looks like from inside of them. Now, there are enormous numbers of problems, and we could spend the next 3 hours talking about that, because people lie to you. Any of the problems that you get when you try to get information from people, and it gets to the whole sort of the most fundamental problems that sociology has to grapple with when we think about other people's behavior. So what is it that you're getting when you get, as Aaron Sickerell would say, an account from a person? What makes me feel moderately confident is I go over the same ground over and over again in the interview, and I weave back in and out, and I have quite a good memory, so that if it's not internally coherent, it shows up. And I know as a fact that I did one interview where something was just weird and I couldn't put my finger on it. And it turned out later it was a right-to-life woman who'd had an abortion, and she later told somebody on national TV she'd had an abortion. But I rely on my, this isn't very sophisticated, but I rely on my gut instincts, my social skills, that if I feel weird, there's something going on there, and I tend to discount the interview. And I also pick up cues about where to press, It's also the case that people say things in interviews that I don't see till I'm analyzing the interviews. So in the Abortion and the Politics of Motherhood book, there was this poignant part where it turns out all these right-to-life women were identifying themselves in terms of the job descriptions of the last paid job they had. So they'd say things like, well, I'm an economist, and I can tell you abortion doesn't make sense financially, or I'm a political scientist, and it's against our Constitution. And here were women sort of active on behalf of traditional family roles, using labels from the world of paid work. I didn't even hear that in the interview until I went back and analyzed it. I guess the other thing is, Josh, when you analyze hundreds of interviews, you start hearing the same things over and over again. And that, again, makes me confident that I've tapped into something real. Whether it's an accurate representation of external social reality, that I'm not trying to make a claim for, but that these people in this social world have consistent worldviews that I can trace from person to person to person, I do claim. And I often tell graduate students, I know when I've done enough interviews because I can move my lips throughout the interview. I know what people are going to say before they say it. They're saturated. With respect to why I use interviewing, I think it's partly because I'm a voyeur. The part of being invited into somebody's home that you would never go into, and how they tell you how the inside of their head is organized, is enormously intellectual.
I know what you mean. That's what I'm experiencing right now.
Yeah. Yes. Moving onwards.
Well, I want to still try to. I'm not sure I've quite explained the question. I really do accept that you get to a point where you've got a pattern. You're getting into something real. It's seems still that what you're giving primacy to there is the ideas.
Mm-hmm.
That what you're getting,
Yeah.
you know, even if it's real, there seems to be, you know, a whole nother model that you could be taking.
Yeah.
And I'm still curious, maybe you could approach it from what kind of criticisms you've gotten on that level. I would think that people, in fact, I think I read something, I couldn't quote the source, that was critiquing you on that basis that, in fact, you're not looking at, when you conclude that the reason that the right is going to win in this debate or is winning in this debate is because they have a stronger commitment to their worldview, or it's a single issue for them as opposed to a more diffuse kind of thing for pro-choice people. That conclusion doesn't take into account funding from the outside, doesn't take into account other kinds of conditions, and it seems.
Yeah.
So what I'm getting at is what you miss when you give primacy
Yeah.
to the values and the worldviews.
Well, I guess, let me be bold here and say, I think I did look at those other factors. So, for example, I take on the question of funding, and I looked at that pretty carefully because everybody thinks the Right to Life movement is superbly funded, and I debunked that idea. Although I'm very careful to say, again, at the national level, it's quite different. And so I think I do look at in a way, I think, let me see if I'm getting to your question finally. When I said I would have rewritten chapter 9, I think I would have done a more top-down analysis, where at least I would have drawn the boundaries a little more clearly between everything that went before, and if you can think of a set of concentric circles, and I'm really studying, if you will, the most innermost ones, I would have explicitly said, there's some other circles out here, folks, that I'm not analyzing, but that doesn't mean they're not out there. And the problem was, as I say, when I got there, that was a whole different book. Because what happens inside the Democratic Party, for example, has consequences for what the Right to Lifers are doing in Salinas. And what, more to the point, what happens in the Republican Party has very real consequences. And I didn't choose to do that level of analysis just because it was a very different kind of analysis. In the book I'm working on now, on sex education, I'm looking more at that, which is, it's sort of the difference between a sort of a close-up lens and a distance lens, that in a way the people, I sort of see myself in a progression, by the way, which is the first book, there are real individual people there, you know, there are these women who've made the decision not to contracept. And then I move back a step, and the second book is about activists, groups of activists who play their way out of different worldviews. And now the book on sex education moves even to a more macro-social level, which is about different interest groups and how different interest groups have different ideologies around sex education that they're trying to implement. And one of the things that I've done is, in the historical part of the sex education work, is to look at specific organizations and the role they play vis-a-vis the government, private philanthropy, etc. So have I answered the question?
Yes, that was
Yeah, you
definitely
did. Does that cover what?
Yeah.
Okay. Then I would like to just throw this one out.
Okay.
Just to find out from you, as someone who does a lot of interviewing professionally, what it's been like to have the tables turned.
To be
what
interviewed?
the difference between experiences.
I mean, not only here, since you've interviewed
Right.
quite a bit.
Well, is that an interesting question? In a way, as I think I said to you when we were thinking about doing this tape, in a way this is the hardest, because the other interviews that I've done, I'm sort of a persona, and I'm either selling my book or making a political point or taking part in the debate. And in a way that's easier because you get to suppress all the dissonant notes. You know, you're just single pointed. Whereas I think here, and it's interesting because in a way I feel I feel a little like the centipede that knew perfectly well how to walk until somebody asked them how they did it, you know? And I guess I was sort of worried and perhaps thinking that we would get to some of those deep existential issues, you know? How does a socially located social scientist take themselves out into the field and presume to gather data? And I think for me, and remember, I am the product of a particular historical moment. I came to sociology the year after the free speech movement, and I learned most of the sociology I learned on the Terrace Cafe here at Berkeley. So for me, there's no alternative of not doing it. You know, you couldn't just withdraw and do semiotics, she said nastily, thereby proving that I'm growing rigid in my old age. I'm sure there are important things about semiotics that I have to learn yet. But that it's our obligation to engage with the social world. It's our obligation to try to make sense of what's going on out there. And another one of the Zen paradoxes is it's our obligation to do that on behalf of the voiceless, even though sometimes the voiceless have values that we don't particularly agree with. So it's been interesting being interviewed, I guess, would be my conclusion.
Is there anything else you'd like to add before we conclude?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Thank you.
Well, thank you
Thank you
very much.
That was very interesting.
It was really interesting.
I can't.
The structure, because I felt so personally close to pro-choice people and so distant from pro-life people. And, you know, it's funny because the book's gotten criticisms for being too sympathetic to the pro-life people. And in a way, their values were so weird and so distant from mine. But I probably did, in a way, dig deeper in for the pro-lifers than I did for the pro-choice people, because their values, I knew what they thought, you know. I'd been in the clinic, they're, you know, the people I went to college with. So it's rather interesting. Yeah. So, but it does pose the problem so interestingly of infinite regress. You know, here you are, a person of a gender and a race and a social class, trying to make sense out of a gendered, class, racial world. You know?
Yeah, well, it is very much also a book about class.
Oh yeah. Although, you know, Leslie, it's interesting. Peter Berger, I was so horrified when the neocons liked my book. I went around for 3 weeks. The neoconservatives.
Oh, okay.
And in fact, I had just been invited, this is a secret, because I'm not going to do it, to a conference by the religion writer for National Review on the new eugenics. Now, I know where this one is going, which is, oh yes, all these, you know what I suggested, this is just class values, that all these values are just class values. And I'm as opposed to letting people reduce those values to class values as I was to reducing the pro-life values to simply class values. But what I was going to say is the more I worked on the book, the less I realized I knew about class in America. In a way, the more messy and complicated real life is relative to my, you know, I reread Marx, I reread Weber, you know, and how do you code a lady who collects empty Avon bottles? I mean, I know what Weber would do, you know. Weber would talk about this as a status group, but and especially for women, because women make choices that affect their class. If you get married, if you get pregnant at 17 and you get married to the guy and he drops out of high school to support you, you've made a class decision. You've made a decision that's going to shape your class location 30 years down the road. And by the same token, if he leaves one day and you say, by God, I can handle this, and you go back to school, that's another class decision. So that's where, you know, when people tried to press me into saying, oh, this is really a working class versus a new professional class issue, isn't it? And every time people would say that, I would try to back off. And yet class is there.
But it may be as much dependent as an independent variable.
Exactly. And how do we create a sociology that's dynamic that way? You know, that can bring in gender and class and values and culture. I mean, the reason these women didn't have the abortion at 17, it's not just because they're Catholic, although that's part of it, but they pick and choose their own culture. You know, remember there's the quote in the book from a woman who says, in the 3rd grade, the nuns lined all the boys up on one side of the room and all the girls up on the other, and I said to myself, the Catholic Church is no friend of mine. You know, so maybe when I'm 80, I'll be able to integrate, you know, structures and actors, and with culture in the middle. Yeah, and that's why we
haven't really started this. It's interesting in Michael's course. It's really interesting to see. You know, we're just finishing up science, non-science issues, philosophy of science, and now we're going to get into this.
With subject observer.
Yeah.
Although the question of structures and actors, I don't think we're going to deal with Michael, but I think it's the big question.
I think so too. I think so too. And I think implicit in the question you ask is that in a way, the level of analysis is a political choice.
Yes, that was
exactly.
You know, and yet, when I think
there you have it. Kind of, I mean, it's it's hard to get past that.
And I guess the best. See, I think you have to make that choice, but the best you can do is sort of make it as self-consciously as you can. It's funny because I also think my own development as a person, I've gotten bolder and I'm willing to work on broader canvases. You know, that I was so, what's the right word? How about oppressed in graduate school? That I knew that when I was talking about those women in the field, that I was right and the literature was wrong. And that was part of the, you know, the blush of being a feminist. You know, here's this conceptual framework that you can use, and by God, it works. You know, and then with this book, I did get to the point where I thought I was at least partially on the things that are objective. I don't have a language to talk about this. On the things that I think of as being objectively true, I think I'm right. The problem you raised, which is the things that are only partially true because of the scope of your frame, that's harder. You know, that's the one that you brood about. And how do you, as an author and a scholar, call attention? Hayden White talks about those as, I think he calls them pre-literary decisions. You know, what the narrative is going to be like, how big the frame is, what kind of structure you impose, and a lot of those are really unconscious. You know, that as in the case of what Torpy called my attention to, you don't know you've really done that until it's over. So.
Yeah, that was actually a very good way of putting it. We actually, Josh and I were
really struggling
hammering this one back and forth, trying to figure out how to say it.
Yeah.
But eventually we did get
Yeah, it's really interesting.
and we got the interview and stuff.
Yes.
Well, and in a way, it's recapitulating the intellectual problem on a personal level, which is how do you bring together individual actors, cultural forces, and structures in a way that's in some way true to life. And I'll tell you what this makes me think of. It's sort of weird, but a lot of times when I talk to students, some of these are really literary problems in addition to scholarly problems. And what it makes me think of is that I'm a little embarrassed to say this, I build dollhouses. And it turns out that if you build things exactly true to scale, it doesn't work. It's like a stage set. You have to cheat visually in order for the eye to recognize it. I'll give you a perfect example. San Francisco row houses are very tall and thin, but they're very deep. They're only 24 feet wide on average, but they're about 40 feet deep. Now imagine a dollhouse that's 24 inches wide, but 40 inches deep. It looks weird, because you walk down the street and you only see the front of San Francisco row houses, right? So you have to cheat. You cannot draw it exactly to scale because it doesn't work. And so, you know, I don't know how you worry about those problems either. And part of, you know, when a book is over, if you've done it well, all the mess doesn't show. You know, it's like how you clean up your house right before the company comes. Excellent.
So there's sort of a disincentive to call attention to the fact that
Yeah.
you're playing with dimensions.
Exactly. Exactly.
Because that means that you're worried you might have screwed it up.
Right. Well, we saw this interview by Todd in which he talks a lot about the literary aspect of writing sociology in the same sense that you would write other things, sort of narrative.
Well, it's interesting because I've noticed good writers can hustle the reader past weak points in the argument. Sort of like, oh, look, over there. As you hustle people by, the gaping hole in the argument. And,
Great story.
yeah.
And I guess if you could figure out a way to really talk about the holes, that you would be doing really good sociology. If you could figure out a way to create an argument and say, and this is a space that doesn't quite work, and this is
But it's
these
very
are
difficult
possible.
to move on.
Yeah.
And if you set up this hole in front of yourself.
I think I've read things, although I
you
can't.
define
What
it
would be an
and
example?
I can't think of any examples, but I have this feeling of somebody saying of things that I've read where somebody says, well, this is a place where there are two choices, and I've made this choice,
Right.
and then they keep going.
there's a kindness to the reader, sort of, where you say, just come with me on this. It's the problem.
And then the reader can go back to that point and go, well, I would have gone another fork. So.
Yeah.
So the danger is that you lose people. That half your readers go back to the fork and say the whole argument didn't work because.
It's interesting because there was an article in the New York Times last week, and I don't know if you saw this, about science writing. Apparently,
Deborah was talking about this.
yeah, at the turn of the century, scientists gloried in talking about their mistakes because that's how they proved they were real empiricists as opposed to dogmatists. Because if you were empiricist, you would obviously make mistakes. You'd start out with hypotheses that were wrong. But that now the whole rhetoric of, Joe Gusto has that marvelous article, The Literary Rhetoric of Science. The rhetoric is, this is the way I did the experiment, and it worked out perfectly.
Oh, that's really funny.
Yeah. Well,
Oh, you
listen.
have to.
Great.
Yeah, you have to
That's
run
great.
up.
Well,
So,
very much.
shall we make a date for the last week in the